from an undisclosable location for reasons of security and therefore insecurity. Cometh the hour, cometh the mothership, that is, Coast to Coast AM. We'll just set her down gently, set her down gently. All right, there we are. Good evening, everybody. John B. Wells in with you for the night. I hope you've had a good week. And tonight, we have a program I think that you will like. We have brought back from just 2 weeks ago, Douglas Dietrich. He'll be with us for the first hour. That's son of a sailor. He has some interesting perspectives on the Vietnam conflict. And not only that, he is a great proponent of an official National Day of commemoration for those who served that long, long war. He will give us some insights on many things, including what year the first American life was lost there, which will give you an idea exactly how long that conflict lasted. I got into a slight little twist last time when I was mentioning the Vietnam conflict. Between 73 and 75, we left largely in 73, but it was officially over in 75. That's when Saigon fell, and so anyway, Douglas will clear us up on that. Then, for the remainder of the show, Dr. Tim Ball. He is a renowned environmental consultant and former professor of climatology at the University of Winnipeg. And his extensive science background in climatology, especially environmental issues and sustainable development, the reconstruction of past climates, and the impact of climate change on human history and the human condition, make him the ideal head of the National Resources Stewardship Project. He works on other things, water resources, pollution prevention, environmental regulations, the impact of government policy on business and economics. Will be invaluable as NRSP tackles other issues as time goes by. Well, the earthquake that was predicted to occur earlier in the week did not happen, but that does not mean that it will not happen. Several students, full-time students of earthquake behavior, are still, if they miss it by a day or two or a week or even a month, it's no big deal, but this is supposed to be a big one. Some have said somewhere up around Alaska. Some have said down around New Zealand, so in the end, they're tracking it with the best data that they have, but all intelligence is well, it's never unambiguous. It's always subject to a little wiggle room. Eric Holder is in a little bit of hot water, as much as he will allow himself to be in. Major news networks, as well as Representative Blake Farenthold, and they're taking to the airwaves to discuss how is it that this information about Fast and Furious lay upon his desk for 10 months. So he either did nothing about it or did not do his job. I'll tell you a quick story. I can't remember where I heard it. But Stalin was about to pass on into the next world, and he summoned Khrushchev to him. And he handed Khrushchev 2 envelopes, marked 1 and 2. And he told Khrushchev, if you get in trouble, open the first envelope. If you get in trouble again, you open the second envelope. Well, the first problem came up, which involved the Berlin situation, and he had to open the first envelope. And on the paper was written, blame it all on me. And so he did. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis came up sometime later, and he opened envelope number 2. And inside, there was one sentence, which read, make out 2 envelopes. It may be time for Mr. Holder to make out 2 envelopes, because I don't think anybody gave him 2 envelopes. Otherwise, I think he would have taken a hike by now, but then again, that's just me. I said it many times, and you've said it too, that the Internet is probably the greatest tool for learning and knowledge and information gathering on this planet. Absolutely unsurpassed for gathering information. However, there are 10 reasons posted on InfoWars, which is always a good little site to go to, which will make you understand that nothing you do on the Internet will ever be private again. The federal government can now retain your Internet activity for 5 years, even if you have no links to terrorism. Potential employers are demanding to see your Internet activity. Law enforcement is watching you. Government agencies are watching you. The White House is watching you. Truth teams, they'll be scouring the internet for any rumors that are not true as the presidential election comes closer. They're monitoring and recording all talk radio. Hi, for anybody uninvited who's joining our program in progress. Hi, we're watching you too, just so you know. Foreign governments are watching you. We are all being encouraged to spy on one another on the internet. Your ISP is watching you. Your internet service provider is watching you. And the NSA is watching everyone and everything. Don't you feel better about technology just every minute? All right, then. Check the Coast to Coast website. You should always check the Coast website, coasttocoastam.com. There's a lot of interesting stuff on there. Some fantastic artwork by Bill Hoflich. Naps News is there. And, of course, you have an opportunity to become a Coast Insider. And for all of you who have done so, as the radio landscape shifts, you have shifted with it. And we thank you very much for that. That will ensure that there is an uninterrupted flow of non-mainstream media material. Think of Coast to Coast as an oasis of rational thought, hidden in the desert of vacuous content and opinion. All right, we'll be bringing on Douglas Dietrich in just a moment, so cinch down and mount up. The Caravan to Midnight leaves in 2 minutes on Coast to Coast AM. You know, many of us lost someone in the Vietnam conflict, so this is going to be a little bit sensitive for some. Come on onto the bridge, Douglas Dietrich, and let us set the stage for our talk tonight, because there's a lot of heartbreak still over Vietnam and the people that were lost there.
Yes, and I really thank you for allowing me to address this issue with the American public, because it really needs to be addressed, because we're going through kind of a replay with the wars that we're going through now, and I want the American public to be aware of the fact that Vietnam is actually the norm when it comes to the American way of war and the American style of conflict. World War II, which was a big mobilization war with a lot of involvement with logistics, was very much the exception to the rule. And World War I was also an exception in terms of an expeditionary force on the European continent. But the main majority of America's struggles have been Vietnam-style conflicts, going back to the American Revolution, which was America's longest declared war, 8 years long. And at that time, we were the Viet Cong. And we were fighting the British Empire with what many would consider a dirty, unorthodox, unconventional form of guerrilla insurgency. And we won ourselves our independence. And going up through to the Vietnam War, there was the Plains Indian Wars, and they were very much the precursor to Vietnam because there was no strategic points to be taken. Basically, all the American Frontier Army could rely on was body counts, which people would read about in papers back in the big cities, and they fought their way to the Pacific, and it was very similar to Vietnam in the sense that many of the Indian resistance fighters would cross the Mexican border, or they'd cross the Canadian border, and thereby the Frontier Army couldn't follow them because that would be a violation of boundaries and treaties with other sovereign nation states that the United States government recognized federally. And so as a result, you had this precursor all the way up through the Philippine insurgency to Vietnam itself. So this has very, very much been the norm of America's type of warfare. But Vietnam was by far the longest war we've ever fought, longer by a decade than what seems to be our now infinite war in Iraq. And because it started in 1945 on September 26th, when during unrest in Saigon, the first American death occurred. It was an OSS officer, meaning Office of Strategic Services, and his name was Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey, and he was killed by Viet Minh guerrillas. And this was right after he had just filed his report stating in his opinion that the U.S. ought to clear out of Southeast Asia. And you're absolutely right. That's what this holiday has to deal with, is our ultimate withdrawal from Vietnam, which was March 29th of 1973. And
Douglas, it's a hell of a thing because we're divided into, it seems like, about three segments.
yeah,
You have the people that stay home watching their loved ones and their friends go off to these wars. You got the ones that actually do go off to the wars, that are actually in the stuff.
yes,
Getting hurt, getting killed.
yes.
And then you got these Prague politicians that are up there orchestrating it all. And so that's why I wanted to talk to you very much, particularly about the commemorization of the end of it. But good Lord, man, this is really kind of a tougher line to try and stay balanced on than I thought it would be, because of all the emotion involved between the politicians who don't care, like Lefty said in Donnie Brasco. A guy you don't know sends you out to go kill another guy that you don't know.
Yeah,
and we're supposed to find nobility in that somewhere.
Yeah, if there's a nobility to be found, it's to be found in this. And this is one reason why this holiday needs to be commemorated, to keep it in the minds of everybody, because this was, whether we consider it casual or symptomatic of American decline, this truly was the defining moment in American history in a way that World War II was not. What people don't understand was that we still had the draft, which was ongoing from World War II, and people responded to that draft. And these were working men that responded to it. And there were, of course, about maybe 20 or 30 American women who died in service in Vietnam. But the overwhelming amount of in those days was that this was a man's war, and men were answering the call. And these were middle-class men. And this is without resorting to some Marxian tactic of creating a sense of class conflict or warfare. Very much what you had was an upper class or a wealthy American elite which did not respond to that call. What Americans don't understand in this day and age is that at that time, the wealthy avoided the draft, and they could do so through their connections, and they did what they had to do to go on leading their normal lives. But the working men who could not escape due to educational reasons, for instance, you were allowed to escape if you got somehow involved with the teaching profession. And as a result, our educational system, which was the highest in the world during the time of the Kennedy administration, when we were producing engineers so that we could continue Kennedy's dream of colonizing the solar system, ultimately at some point in history, all that came crashing down because that was predominantly, overwhelmingly, at the pre-high school level, a female-dominated profession. But a lot of misguided liberal professors thought that they would save a lot of young men from the battlefield, so they invited a bunch of draft dodgers in to teaching positions at the lower levels, pre-high school levels, kicked a bunch of women out of the school system. The end result was you had a bunch of young draft dodgers who didn't know how to teach, who were teaching kids. That's when our educational system crashed. So America crashed at home as opposed to on the battlefield. Because on the battlefield, in a very real sense, in a military sense, the war was essentially won in the sense that the Viet Cong insurgency forces were ultimately eliminated on the field of battle, and the North Vietnamese army was fought to a standstill. So militarily, many things were accomplished, while many things were lost domestically at home in a way that people really haven't comprehended in history yet. And,
Douglas, it's interesting. You mentioned Kennedy.
Yeah.
I can't have escaped your notice that actually Joe, the oldest son, was lost in World War II. He was the one that Joe Sr. wanted to groom for high political office, maybe even the presidency.
Yes.
John was actually his second choice, and just a few months after John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated, into Vietnam we go. Do you see the black hand there, or what? I do.
I do as well, and there certainly is a lot more to that discussion. That would take us on a course that I want to avoid right now to do justice to the men of the Vietnam War, because those men were products of World War II. That was a time when the wealthy did go to war and were participating almost out of a sense of gentlemanly sport. And but in terms of, as a matter of fact, without dwelling on it over much, during the times of Teddy Roosevelt, if you ever take a look at the uniforms of Roosevelt's Rough Riders, the collar insignia say USGV. That stands for United States Gentlemen Volunteers. And those were wealthy men who paid for and raised their own armies to go to war, because war was a sport of kings. And then we went to World War II, where there was still a remnant of that romance. By the time we got to Vietnam, this was a working man's war. And the tragedy is that many of those working men are now listening to us tonight in tent cities. And so this holiday is to bring them to attention, because so many of them are homeless. And I've talked about the homeless problem before, and I definitely want to go over that right now again, because it creates such a enormous amount of our population's problems that we see on the streets. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs admits that on any given day, as many as 250,000 veterans, both male and female, are living on the streets or in shelters, and at least twice as many experience homelessness at some point during any course of the year. And you've got this problem where you've got, for instance, veterans comprising about 6% of the overall population back in 2004, and they were 23% of the homeless. That meant 1 out of every 3 homeless men were vets. Today, veterans comprise 9% of the population, but 42% of the homeless. So 1 out of every 3 homeless men is still a veteran. And essentially half, 46% of homeless veterans, are my age. That's 45 years old or older, compared to 20% of the civilian homeless. That's because they're Vietnam vets, the overwhelming majority of them. And the number of homeless male and female Vietnam-era veterans is greater than the number of service persons who, as officially acknowledged, died during that conflict. And even though almost half of homeless vets, about 47%, served in the NAM, the rest come from World War II and every era since, including peacetime, which hasn't existed since 1990 per Title 38 of the U.S. Code. But the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans cites federal figures. More than 67% served our country for at least 3 years, and 35% were stationed in a war zone. Now, what was the cause of this? What was the cause of this was that in 1947, when America was demobilizing, the largest demobilization in the history of the world from World War II, then what happened was they basically said that we've got to keep men re-enlisting. And since they won't re-enlist, what we're going to do is we're going to make them re-enlist by making them unemployable in the civilian world. So they instituted what was known as an SPN, a separation program number, on the DD-214, totally unknown to veterans. This was a cryptic code that had over 500 choices, and all of these over 5,000 choices were overwhelmingly negative. And the CO, our commanding officer, had total capricious whim, free hand, over everyone's record as to which one of these codes he would apply. And between 1947 to 1974, during that entire period of time, because we pulled out of Vietnam in 1973, then the Pentagon was forced to officially admit to the SPN code and their slanderous secret program, mass defamation program against the majority of their own soldiers, and they were pressured by Democratic Congress to get rid of it. But veterans discharged during the 47 to 74 SPN period still have that marker on their DD-214 to this day. And just to give you an example of what a fraction of what those SPN codes stood for, and by the way, potential employers knew what these were, and they came on every type of discharge: honorable, general, dishonorable, other than honorable. And what would happen would be that job applicants who were vets were required by law to make their DD-214s available to potential employers, and those people in turn would ask the Pentagon or look up the codes in lists that had been published in obscure, unclassified military documents. But employers were well aware of what each code meant, especially at the corporate level, even at the mom-and-pop level. And but you know what they meant were as follows: admission of homosexuality or bisexuality, alcoholism, antisocial, desertion, bedwetting, criminality, drug use, financial irresponsibility, indebtedness, obesity, pregnancy, that was used on women obviously, disloyalty, subversion, schizoid personality, national security risk, concealment of arrest record. It just went on, all the way down to withdrawal of ecclesiastical endorsement, meaning that your chaplain thought you were irreligious, or just lazy, sexual deviant. It was just preposterous. And the omega point of betrayal, and my late father was a victim of this, was personnel records, so necessary for the task of reviewing and reassessing such a sham in both medical and military terms. These were all taken and interned, along with those of many millions of other veterans from many other wars, all going back to the Filipino insurrection after the Spanish-American War, all the way up through the fall of Saigon in 1975.
All right, hold it right there, Douglas. Let's take ourselves a little break, and you just pick up where you left off. Douglas Dietrich, Unknowns about Vietnam. When we return, Coast to Coast AM. It's a Red Flash Saturday night episode of Coast to Coast as we speak with Douglas Dietrich about a day of commemoration for the longest war. We got a close second behind it, but from 1964 to 1975, and even earlier, with losses going back to 1945. The first OSS man was lost there, Office of Strategic Services, which morphed into the CIA. We will continue with him after a 2-minute break. Please stand by. Coast to Coast AM will continue. Wells in with you for the night with Douglas Dietrich. Douglas, so are we to understand that there was like deliberate vilification of these people to keep them within the system?
Just one part of it, sir. That was part of the ultimate betrayal. The omega point of the ultimate betrayal came with their medical and personnel records documents that could have led to revision of these records, reassessment of these records. They were taken and put into this documentary Wicker Man called the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. George Noy, who's going to be with us at the 12th Annual Conspiracy Con in the first 3 days of June of this year, he drives by there pretty much every time he's doing the radio in St. Louis, Missouri. He could tell by the architecture of its concrete abutments and its many feet of barbed wire, and the structures being very far in from these external protective barricades, that it would be impossible to go in and sabotage it unless you were somebody who worked on the inside yourself, and that's exactly what happened. This architectural fire trap was a combination of in construction of a grain silo and a tinder box. The local municipal fire department protested the fact that neither fire alarms or sprinkler systems were installed, but as the edifice was on federal property, nothing could be done for it. Now, the GSA, the General Services Administration, runs the Federal Archives. The regional office in the state of California was in San Bruno, and in the course of my primary career as a civilian military librarian, I was able to review an in-house Federal Archives Agency training reel exposing the fact that 15 starting points of inception instigated the conflagration that consumed this pile of documents in July of 1975. And the embers of this facility smoldered for over a month, but the Federal Archives Agency had saved the U.S. government billions and billions of dollars in veterans' compensation, not to mention obscuring any historical culpability in any atrocities that were cited by those files. As an aside, both Lee Harvey Oswald's and James Earl Ray's military service medical dossiers were conveniently incinerated in that firestorm, just to name a few of the lost celebrity files. And any VA bureaucrat will confirm to this day that the Veterans Administration is still dealing with the repercussions of that arson and will perforce continue to do so until the last Vietnam vet drops dying. And it almost goes without saying that the operations manager of that particular federal facility, and I know this because I was a DOD librarian, he was found with a bullet in his brain, classified as a suicide. They probably came to work too early that day and saw what was going on. And the inferno itself was attributed by the U.S. media to war protesters, a physical impossibility based on what I described. And I spoke about it with George Noy briefly on air before, and he agreed that there's no way any war protesters could get in there and do what was done. The nature of the fire was presented as the functional equivalent of a grain dust explosion in a grain silo, supposedly sourcing from accumulated dust stirred by records activity. And because of that, I had to find, my father was injured in 3 wars. His tombstone in upstate New York says World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. I had to find 3 separate witnesses to each wound he suffered in each different war before I could get him recognized for disability. And with that kind of challenge, you can imagine why the average vet from Vietnam or any other war has so much problems proving their disabilities, so they can't get medical compensation, and they wind up on the streets. And so this is the kind of betrayal that America has presented to thousands of veterans. And we had so many men serving in Vietnam, people don't realize what a chunk it took out of our middle class. Today's war in Iraq and Afghanistan, these are poor man's wars, because now we don't even have that much of a middle class. It's no longer a draft army. So the only people volunteering in the main are enormously poor people. And so we've gone from a middle-class war of draftees to, after they destroyed anybody's desire to answer that call because of Vietnam, now we've got a so-called professional army of the poor who have no other option in order to put meals in their stomachs. And so this is a situation we're dealing with today. If we confront it with a national holiday recognizing Vietnam Veterans Memorial Day, commemorating it on the 29th of March, celebrating our withdrawal from Vietnam as a kind of homecoming, then we can help with civilian veteran reconciliation. That's how the media got away with it. When they blamed it on war protesters, why would everyone accept that? Because in that day, the Vietnamese, unlike the Japanese in World War II, who had a brilliant way of dealing with the Americans in terms of weapons of mass destruction, ultimately forcing a strategic stalemate and super-secret talk-down processes, the Vietnamese in the North had what they called Dick Von. Dick Von just meant to action among the enemy is the literal translation. And what they did with Soviet support was to get the wealthy classes, which weren't going to war, to support the communist movement. Now, your Vietnam Memorial Wall, which has over 58,000 names on it, wasn't designed by an American. It was designed by an Amerasian, actually a pure Asian young lady, unlike myself who's Amerasian. Her name was Maya Yinglin, and her parents fled from communist China when the communists took over the mainland in 1949, and she was so grateful to the Americans fighting communism anywhere on the Asian mainland that she designed the Vietnam Memorial Wall. And during that period of time that she and myself, who was born in Taiwan, came to the United States, along with thousands and thousands of other Vietnamese boat people, Asian immigrants fleeing communism on the Asian mainland, what did we see? The first thing we saw was tens of thousands of white Americans parading throughout all of America's major cities, waving Mao's Little Red Book, portraits of Ho Chi Minh, and quoting Marx and Lenin, and saying how great it was that communism was sweeping on the Asian mainland. That's when we all realized, and that's why we all have such a sense of political detachment, we all realized we had jumped out of the fire and into the frying pan. And
well, how about when everybody marched into the Olympics? That was Mao's picture over the door to the big Coliseum where the games were held.
Yes, yes. And it was very much, at that time, America, as I said, won the war on the field. Don't make no mistake about it. There were at least 50 battles lost in Vietnam. But overall, the American Army, and especially the Marine Corps, had a stellar record in the combat field and accomplished their objectives per their orders. However, what happened at home was more than a disgrace. It was essentially a communist takeover. And it becomes more and more apparent with each and every passing day. And I think that that's what we have to contend with in the future. This is why recognizing this day is so important, so that we can fend that day off, if not permanently, then at least for a generation longer by keeping that memory alive. Whenever we're fighting about history, we're fighting about the future. And it's only thanks to men such as yourself making this possible that we can do this and help bring it to the attention of people in the United States. The other issue is the veterans that we abandoned overseas, which would be the prisoners of war. And, at the end of the Vietnam War in 1973, the U.S. government officially acknowledged about 2,400 men missing in action. Now, on the wall, it's only got listed 1,200 names, which are specified as missing instead of killed. This would mean they're missing in action, prisoner of war, etc. But the reality was, and I know this because I ran the ovens and I burned the records, was that the American government listed 5,000 American soldiers held prisoner by the Vietnamese, and only 591 were repatriated. That means we got only a little over 10% back. And so a lot of people are familiar with the money game behind it. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Harrington, who worked on the POW MIA issue, dealt specifically with the North Vietnamese and the People's Republic of China from 1973 till 1975, from American withdrawal till the fall of Saigon. And they were quite adamant and open with telling him that U.S. POWs would be returned when the reparations that Kissinger promised to the North Vietnamese were paid. And so that payment, of course, amounted in the billions of dollars in terms of reparations. And the Senate voted 88-3, roll call vote to indicate that aid to North Vietnam would be impossible. And if you ask me, with all of the money that we spend on so much of everything else, we should pay that money to the Vietnamese government today, even if it's just to get bodies back, just on the principle of it. And so that's something that I'm hoping that the American public can be galvanized into again, even though it's far too late for so many of them. As someone who's of Asian background, has Asian connections, I can tell you there were Japanese Buddhist missionaries, monks who were captured by the communists and thrown into prison camps. A few of them said that they were nursed back into health by American prisoners of war, and this was in the 1990s. And that's, you know, this is the kind of nonsense that they tell this on the news in Asia, but you don't hear this here. And so it's something that disgusts me. And believe me, the number of names that are on that wall, the almost 60,000 that I mentioned, is well below. It should be twice that number, because what the U.S. government admits to has nothing to do with the reality. There were at least 2,000 airmen lost in Vietnam. And to show you what kind of a war this was and how intense it was, a lot of people talk about Afghanistan as being the Soviet Union's Vietnam. And it was directly on their border. They were heavily engaged in Afghanistan, and yet their commitment to Vietnam was absolutely nothing compared to that of the United States. The largest race riots in American prison history took place not in the United States, but in Vietnam at LBJ, Long Binh Jail, where enlisted men who had been responsible for fragging their officers were thrown in the brig. And you had so many men in those brigs, which goes to show you how many officers were fragged, that you had literally thousands of Caucasian and African-American soldiers going at each other in those prisons. And that's how many men we had involved. And as a matter of fact, they had their own currency, military payment certificates, during the 27-year period when military payment certificates were in use. And please listen to what I'm saying. Numismatic collectors, coin collectors, money collectors, 27-year period shows you how long that war was. There were 13 different issues of these notes. Dollar bills with pictures of soldiers in place of presidents. And on the back, instead of architectural places of the White House or Mount Vernon, we had pictures of B-52 bombers. And this is the kind of involvement we had there. And in terms of the Navy, you had cruisers, destroyers, full-flag battleships even, conducting offshore bombardment deep into territories in Vietnam. And you had over half the total of combat missions into North Vietnam were naval aircraft, and over 550 of them were shot down. That's over 500 carrier planes. That's over 40 squadrons. With combat losses like that, that's worse than all the carrier battles in World War II combined. And so if you don't think that this was a monumental conflict that chewed up America and needs to be honored, then I think that you're truly in denial of the historical impact which we see all around us to this day.
The only thing I remember is that Lyndon Johnson came on TV and said that we would commit some forces there, but I don't recall that it required a congressional approval of any kind. We just went and stayed for over a decade.
And it had its own version of the Pearl Harbor, the Tonkin Gulf incident, which was a false flag incident. That's what led to the commitment of regular troops in Vietnam. Till then, it was special forces, and I do need to say this, they were some of the finest special forces in the world. You've been kind enough to talk about the largest amount of Congressional Medals of Honor going to the 442nd, the Japanese Americans. Well, the only other unit in the American forces that could compete with them would be the MACV-SOG, the Military Assistance Command of Vietnam Studies and Operations Group. Very innocuous name. And there were fewer than 100 Americans assigned to it at any one time. They had enormous casualties. I mean, think about what I'm saying. Fewer than 100 Americans assigned at any one time, and yet they had, at points in their history, a 100% fatality rate. But for every one of them that died, they killed at least 150 enemy troops. That's how incredibly committed and well-trained these men were. And almost nobody's heard about them. And but to just finalize this with how connected Vietnam is to our history, a lot of people don't understand this, but I've talked before about the Japanese staying on the Chinese mainland till 1949. It's important to emphasize that at the end of World War II, 4,000 Japanese troops joined the Viet Minh, led by Lieutenant Colonel Makuyama, who was later killed in action fighting the French. And these troops included the Kempe Tai, the Japanese military secret police, or their version of the Gestapo. And as a matter of fact, they all served as technicians, trainers with the Viet Minh, and in combat. The entire Japanese 51st Mountain Artillery Regiment, some 900 strong, provided the core around which the Viet Minh would build their first artillery units. So there were also members of the German Asian version of the Africa Corps, which was the Orient Corps. They also became part of the Viet Minh Foreign Legion. This was because East Germany became an ally and accepted many Vietnamese immigrants. There's little Saigons all over East Germany. And,
never heard of such a thing. No one's ever said anything. I've never heard anybody say this except for you.
Ho Chi Minh adopted one of these Nazis who took the name of Ho Chi Long. So this was all a continuity of World War II. Very important to remember that. It's very much hidden from history like so much else. And in the end result was we got to a point with the fall of Dien Bien Phu, which started on March 30th. Keep in mind that March 29th here is March 30th in Pacific Asia because of the international date line. And what had happened was with Dien Bien Phu, the enormous French garrison, about 10,000 French troops surrounded by 40,000 Viet Minh at the time, the French appealed to the United States to use atomic weapons. And thus was born Operation Vulture. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Arthur Radford, Vice President Richard Nixon, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, all organized it, came up to Eisenhower, and they got 2 aircraft carriers, entered the Gulf of Tonkin. B-29s were readied at Clark Field in the Philippines. Elements of the 3rd Marine Division were placed on alert. 100 aircraft were involved. 5 U.S. servicemen were captured by the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu. They became the U.S. prisoners of war in the Vietnam War, the first U.S. POWs. And in terms of all this, Eisenhower, when he was presented with all this, and they said, we've got to drop 2 or 3 atomic bombs to relieve the garrison, he said, what the hell for? It didn't work on the Japanese. He knew exactly what I've been talking about before on Coast to Coast AM, and he didn't want to...
Well, you know, and Douglas MacArthur said, don't get involved in a land war in Asia. It's a bad mistake. All right, we're down to 2 minutes now, my friend. So tell us, what can we do in furtherance of this commemorative day?
Write your servicemen. We've got a few days before March 29th. Write your representatives, your congressmen, your senators, whoever is your representative. I beg you to do that, and then we can get the ball rolling. I mean, there's nothing else better we can do than that. It's supposed to be a participatory democracy. If we participate, we can get this happening. I'd also like to take advantage of this time to invite you to join us for an on-site live feed broadcast from the lobby of the Santa Clara Marriott during the first 3 days of June at the Conspiracy Con for 2012. George Norrie's going to be there. Brian Sussman's going to be there. They need no introduction. Neither does John B. Wells. And I'm hoping that this will be an opportunity for them to meet you. Once they find out how intimidating you look, they may be reluctant to call in the future, but at least we'll get that started. And please, go to my website. I talk about such things in my DVD package. We're going to sell them till we run out of our current run of DVD sets. We're offering towards this end 2 DVDs for the price of 1 at douglasdietrich.com, www.douglasdietrich.com. All the information you need on ConspiracyCon will be there as well, the schedules for it. You can look it up or Google or search engine it. As for a personal appearance, I'll be speaking at the 2012 Summit. Please look that up on my website this Saturday, May 12th of this year. I'm really looking forward to the Super Soldier Summit. It's going to be in Marin County. We can't give the location of the exact venue to anyone for security.
We'll put the word out.
Buy the ticket.
We'll put the word out, brother. Thank you for coming on the show. We'll be talking again soon. Douglas Dietrich. Always an unusual perspective. Always good. This is Coast to Coast. Stand by. Thank you, Ross Mitchell. One can judge from experiment, or one can blindly accept authority. To the scientific mind, experimental proof is all-important, and theory is merely a convenience in description, to be junked when it no longer fits. Or in other words, climate is what you expect. Weather is what you get. And both of those quotations are from the great science fiction writer Robert A. Heinlein, Starship Troopers, Stranger in a Strange Land, Glory Road, and others. In 2 minutes, we will welcome onto the bridge Dr. Tim Ball, and he will discuss what is all this rending of garments, tearing of hair, gnashing of teeth, and otherwise spewing of bull-based vegetable fertilizer regarding climate change and all of this bloody policy that comes and goes. All of these forums that are called only to be snowed out when we return on Coast to Coast AM. Please welcome onto the bridge Dr. Tim Ball. He is with us again tonight after, a visit with ship's Captain George Norrie on February 14, 2012. But we'll see if we can spin off the trail and ask some really indiscreet questions with him tonight. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you for the opportunity, John.
Thanks for coming back on the show. Say, what is all of this? I think I might have said rending of teeth and gnashing of hair. I might have got it wrong, but nobody seems to. We're coming up on an election here. We have 4 GOP candidates, and none of them seem to be on the same page. So since the government is in control of policy, or at least they're trying to be, what do you make of all of this?
Well, of course, it's not surprising that the 4 GOP candidates don't know much, and as you said, they're very diverse in their views. And Newt Gingrich sitting down with Nancy Pelosi, and you'd think they'd have completely opposite views on it, but they didn't. Santorum seems to have some grasp of what's going on with the climate science, but it's typical. I mean, one of the problems is that it's a science issue, and it's been made a political issue, but the politicians don't, for the most part, don't understand the science. There are 1 or 2 that have caught on to what's been going on. Senator Inhofe recently came out with his book on the deception of it. But generally that's part of the problem, that the politicians don't understand, and therefore they tend to either shy away from it or take a political approach to it. But of course that's a problem because the whole of climate science has been hijacked for a political agenda. So we just end up with a mess of pottage, as they say, and of course the public are left confused. They don't really know what to understand either. And part of the reason for that is that 80% of the public are terrified of numbers and science, and so they're easily misled, and that's what's been going on.
I wonder why it is that we do this time, but we rarely see anyone with the prefix of doctor coming anywhere near the political arena, and yet they're in control of so much.
Well, of course, the idea that ideas coming out of the ivory tower can have enormous influence in society and can be misused as well. But you've got two problems going on right now as far as I'm concerned. You've got some scientists that are going along with the political agenda of climate science to achieve, control. But you've also got an awful lot of scientists that themselves don't understand, because one of the problems with climate is it's a generalist discipline. I mean, you talked about the difference between, or saying climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. Well, when you stand out in the weather, what you're experiencing is everything from cosmic radiation in deep space to heat coming off the bottom of the oceans, geothermal heat, and everything in between. And so, and of course, putting that all together creates the weather. But to identify any one part of that is causing the weather of that day or the change of that day is very, very difficult. And then when you take that climate is the average of the weather, then it becomes even more complicated. And of course, so in other words, climate's a generalist discipline, but the most scientists nowadays are specialists. So you've got each person that maybe knows about one piece of the puzzle, but we've really lost the box top. And that's the difficulty I've had as a climatologist who's trying to pull together all of these specialized pieces. And of course, one of the things that's been breaking it down, John, is that as some of the specialists start to look at how the science has been used for climate, they start to realize that, hey, you can't do that. I mean, the classic example is that when a statistician, Steve McIntyre, saw the hockey stick graph, now this is the graph that came out in the 2001 IPCC report, and it shows temperature virtually unchanged for almost 1,000 years, then a sudden upkick in the 20th century. And McIntyre, when he first saw it, he didn't know it was a climate graph, but he knew that there was something wrong with it from his knowledge of statistics and graphing. And he'd been in the mining industry. He knew about how they fiddle with statistics to make mining claims look better than they are. And so he realized what these people had done with the statistics to achieve a result. And so this is a lot of the problem with why people are having a hard time understanding what's going on.
Now, about you, Dr. Ball.
Yeah.
How does a man become? What led you to become a climatologist? I mean, were you fascinated or interested in weather, or what led you to this quest?
Well, I was in the Canadian Air Force and chasing Russian submarines around the North Atlantic, and of course. Right. Typical Canadian Air Force, they never told you what you do if you caught one. And then I served 5 years of search and rescue in Arctic Canada. And of course, that the flying, you obviously you've got to become aware of the weather. And but seeing the Arctic weather and the variability of it, and of course the landscape, that's really got me interested. I lost my flying category because of hearing loss. And decided to go back to university, and I went back at the age of 30. And by the way, I happen to think that's the best age or certainly older is the way to go back to university when you got an idea of who you are and what you want to do. But anyway, I thought, climate, there's a nice, interesting area, and I'll study that. And of course, I got into it. This is back in the 70s, late 60s and 70s. And ironically, in those days, the consensus was global cooling. The world had been cooling down from 40 to 70, and that was the consensus. And, of course, I was as opposed to that as I am to the latest consensus about warming, and because I knew the climate cycles all the time. But those are the reasons that I got into it. And of course, also, there was the whole new paradigm of the way we look at the world of environmentalism, and that fascinated me too, how humans related to the environment and the environment affected humans. So the climate was part of that. So that's how I got into it.
You know, it's interesting. I'm tempted to sort of, we've got some time here to discuss these things, but it's like, all of this is man-made. Well, let me ask you this. Now, on a long flight from Houston clean over to Cape Town, at very high altitude, you could still see the exhaust left by the jet going the other way, even up, in the high 30,000s and low 40,000 feet altitudes. So apart from just soot and just general nastiness from waste from internal combustion engines and everything else, is there anything to suggest that just the presence of large numbers of human beings, now numbering around 7 billion, is having an effect, or does the Earth really not care?
I think there's two things that we've got to separate out. One is that the argument about humans causing global warming and or climate change, and of course that was one of the ways that the public could sense that there was something wrong when they moved the goalposts, because they were talking about global warming, and then they ran into the problem that the CO2 kept going up, but the temperatures were going down, so they changed the goalposts to climate change. That you've got to separate that out from, and of course the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are trying to argue that it's just human CO2 that's pushing the CO2 in the atmosphere up, and that's what's causing all these changes. And that they only reach that conclusion because it's how they've defined what the problem is. So they've said this is the problem, and then they prove it. It's not the way you do science at all. But the other side of it is they've introduced this idea about pollution as if somehow CO2 is a pollutant. It isn't. CO2 is a very, very important gas for the plants on the planet, and of course the plants produce oxygen, therefore it's important to all of life on the planet. But the pollution is a different issue. Now, part of it also is tied up, and this is what's always fascinated me, John, is that they talk about, and I remember Greenpeace had a book out back in the 80s on global warming. Professor Leggett out of Oxford was the editor of it, and they said CO2 is added to the atmosphere naturally and unnaturally. And I said, well, what does that mean? What does that statement mean? They say, well, it's added naturally. Oh, that unnatural stuff, that's what humans add. Oh, so what humans are doing is unnatural, does that mean we're unnatural? And of course, your comment about the 7 billion, you didn't imply it, but that's the implication a lot of people get from that, is that somehow whatever humans do is unnatural and wrong. But we've got as much right on this planet as all the other animals do. Now, and then by the way, that's why you still see, as part of the overall and larger debate that's going on, the whole evolution thing. Richard Dawkins, God is dead, and all that. That's all part of this same argument about whether humans are natural, whether they should be on the planet or not, what they do is unnatural, and so on. And so it's all part of this same debate that's grown out of the whole environmental movement and the use of it for a political agenda. But of course, the ironic thing is, if you say, well, humans are unnatural, then you're left with what they don't agree with, and that is that, then we must have been put here by a greater being. And, they won't buy that either, because now we're starting to talk creationism. So a lot of these people don't even think about the philosophical contradictions that they create in their arguments. But if we're talking about, are humans changing the Earth? Absolutely. Are there ways in which that can alter the climate? Absolutely. I mean, I back in the 1970s, early 70s, we were doing studies on how the climate of the city of Winnipeg was different than the surrounding countryside. And it's now reasonably well known as the urban heat island effect. And so, humans have an effect just like any species does. I mean, have you ever seen a chunk of the forest when a herd of elephants go through, as an example, or the changes that a beaver creates when they build a dam and flood a whole valley? How does that impact the other animals living in that valley? So this is all part of this larger debate. The driving force behind what is going on with environment, with climate, it goes back to Malthus in the 18th century, and he said that the population is going to outgrow the food supply. Well, that's turned out to be wrong. But that idea was picked up in the 1960s by something called the Club of Rome, and there were the first computer study, a very simplistic one, and of course the computers are not that much more sophisticated today, but they produced a book called Limits to Growth, where they simplistically said, here's the population, and here's how it's going to increase, and therefore it will exhaust all the resources. So they took the basic Malthusian idea that we're going to outgrow the food supply and said we're going to outgrow everything. And that's why you hear them talking about things like peak oil. And, of course, then what happens? They suddenly discover a whole lot more oil, so we're not at the peak anyway. And then they're also now, by the way, starting to talk about peak water, because that'll be the next environmental scare. But the Club of Rome were the ones that really were at the heart of this. And of course, they wanted to stop growth, development, industrial growth in particular, because the argument they made was that the exhaustion, or the rate at which we're using the resources, is dramatically increased by industrialization and development, particularly as it was manifested in the United States. And so this is what's behind all of this. But they needed to pick. They wanted to find, and you can read them in their 1974 book, Turning Point. They wanted a vehicle to scare the people and to convince them that we were just destroying the planet and we better change our ways. And incidentally, there's some interesting connections here, John, because the work on population in the 60s and early 70s was done by Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb. Some of the listeners will know about that.
Yes.
He was publishing articles with a gentleman by the name of John Holdren. And, of course, John Holdren is the current science czar for President Obama. And so the whole population issue is still there. Another sort of interesting connection was that there was a conference in Cairo, Egypt in the 1990s on world population, and the keynote opening speaker there and the U.S. representative was Vice President Al Gore. So these names keep popping up. But the key comment, the key person in organizing all of it was Morris Strong. And Morris Strong, I'm sad to say, he was a Canadian fellow who came out of Oak Lake, Manitoba, and I've talked to people that were in school with him, worked with him, and worked for him. But he went, at 15, he went down to the U.S. and did very, very well as an industrialist, made a lot of money, but decided that the money and the industry was evil, and as so many of these people do once they make the money. And so he was a member of the Club of Rome. He made the statement about 30 years ago that the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? And it's a very interesting comment, because what it makes you do, I think, should make you think about, well, how would you go about shutting down industrialized nations? And the best way to think about it, John, is to think that an industrialized nation in the modern context runs on fossil fuels, just like a car engine. Well, there's two ways to stop the car engine. One is you can squeeze the fuel line, cut off the energy supply, or you could plug the exhaust. Either way, it'll stop the engine. Yes. But if you put that in the context of a nation, if you cut off the energy flow, the people will scream right away. And you've got a perfect example of that going on right now with the gas prices going up in the U.S., and everybody's screaming like mad about it. But if you could show that the byproduct of that fossil fuel burning was destroying the climate and sending the world into runaway global warming or into uncontrollable and disastrous climate change, then you could use that as a vehicle to force people to change their ways and their behavior and effectively shut down those industrialized nations. And, of course, that's what Morris Strong did. And he one of the things of all the people that I've talked to that knew him and worked with him, the one thing they concede with him is that he's a brilliant organizer of bureaucracies. And, of course, that's what he did. When he was challenged on that statement about shutting down the industrialized nations, Elaine Dewar, who was the reporter that was interviewing him, said, well, if you've got those views, why don't you run for politics? And he made a very telling comment at that point, because he said, oh, you can't do anything as a politician. He said, I'm going to the United Nations where I can get all the money I want and not be accountable to anybody. And, of course, that's exactly what he did.
Excellent. When we come back with Dr. Tim Ball, we'll discuss a little bit more about John Malthus and maybe even the Club of Rome. Yes, there's something rotten in Denmark, but it got snowed on, didn't it? Coast to Coast AM will continue. Thanks, Ross. I don't know why, but sometimes I just get the feeling that everywhere I look, there's some sort of conspiracy, particularly if it involves a government. We started off with Douglas Dietrich tonight, and now we're with Dr. Tim Ball, and isn't it funny? The things that they have to bring to our party with a small p, not a capital P. We'll get to the party with the capital P later. It all seems to have a common thread running through it. That there really are great unseen powers that just manipulate us this way and that way, and we look over there, look at all that noise. Look, the noise is coming from over there, so we all look. It's like walking out on the street, and one person looks up, and pretty soon several people are looking up. And in the meantime, somebody's running off with the jewels from the jewelry store back there, while the jeweler stands out on the sidewalk looking up into the sky. It's unbelievable. But I got to tell you something, folks. You know, we use that word folks a lot. We've used the word folks just a whole lot since 2008. Folks is folks, so we're all folks. How about this one? We're building a communist organization to be part of the forces, which will build a revolutionary communist party to lead the working class to seize power and build socialism. Bernadine Dorn, Weather Underground, 1970s Pentagon Air Force women's bathroom bomber, SDS activist, wife of William Ayres, just a neighbor of, well, take a wild guess. And then John Malthus. Oh, boy. We're not going to make it. Human beings are just a plague upon the planet, need to go away. You know what I say? I think we can say this on the air, can't we, Dave? Bollocks. We'll continue with Dr. Tim Ball as we explore the mystery of climate change on Coast to Coast AM. John B. Wells with you tonight with Dr. Tim Ball. Dr. Ball, is this true that in the do you know of this first a report entitled The First Global Revolution? This goes back to 91, published by the Club of Rome, which is a globalist think tank whose members have included leading American politicians such as Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, and Al Gore, as you mentioned. The following statement is found in Searching for a New Enemy to Unite Us. We came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. Is such a thing even possible that if someone were actually able to conceive such an idea, why would they be silly enough to put it into print? And if they were, how stupid are we not to have picked up on it and exposed it? And if we have exposed it, why is there no reaction to it?
Well, for part of the reason is because we don't listen to what people write. We don't pay attention. And the classic example, and I used to tell my students about this. Most people, when they're younger and they're setting out what their ambitions are going to be in life, they write books about it or articles about it. And the classic one is Hitler published Mein Kampf. And what did we do in the West? We banned the bloody book. And yet he told us in that book exactly what he planned to do if he ever got power. And so, that's why these people can put these things out in full view and get away with it. And the other thing is it's tied in with your comments earlier about conspiracy. They've thrown this term out there as a distraction. Oh, don't listen to that guy. He's just a conspiracy theorist. Well, I'm sorry, conspiracies do occur. And I know that because I was born on the 5th of November. Now, that wouldn't mean much to American audiences, but to English audiences, the 5th of November is Guy Fawkes Day. And back in 1609, Guy Fawkes, who was against the Parliament and the Crown, was caught in the basement of the Parliament buildings with several barrels of gunpowder, and he was going to blow up the Parliament. The joke in England is that he's reputedly the only man that ever went to Parliament with good intentions. So there are conspiracies throughout history, and invariably they are out in the open. And, of course, one of the things with the use of environmental or scientific things like climate change, and even with water. I mean, water's going to be will be the next one. They're already talking about it, and they had Water Day just the other day. But people don't understand the science, so they can very easily fool them. And the other thing that they do, John, is very quickly, the minute that anybody dares to speak up about it, they're immediately isolated. They're immediately branded and attacked with personal attacks, the what's called ad hominems, and the ones against me. Oh, well, he's paid by the oil companies, when I've never received a nickel from any oil or energy company. But you put that out on the internet, then people Google me. Oh, yeah, he's paid by the oil companies. Don't trust him. And the other side of it, of course, what's amusing is if you get money from government, somehow that's okay. Or if you get money from Greenpeace, that doesn't come with strings attached to it. And so these are some of the reasons that the people are able to get away with these things. And as I said, for the most part, people are just trying to survive from day to day. And so these things are sort of going on for them somewhat in the background. But eventually they blossom out. And, of course, we're seeing now, and one of the reasons we talked about the CO2 becoming the focus, very few people know that it's less than 4% of the total greenhouse gases. And yet it's become the focus. It's become, oh, yeah, you buy a car, it only produces this much CO2, and industries are being threatened with shutdown by the EPA because they produce too much CO2. What they're doing with the CO2 issue is like you talked about with the magic. Oh, look at this hand over here. Keep an eye on the CO2. Oh, by the way, in the meantime, what we're doing is putting in place rules and regulations and control through the bureaucracies until suddenly we can come in and we can shut anything down on the basis of environment. Now, just give you an illustration of how this works. This year, they're having the 20th anniversary of the 1992 Rio Conference, which, of course, was organized by our friend Morris Strong. And at the Rio Conference, they brought in what was called Agenda 21. This was a whole strategy for how you're going to have a world government that would run the world in the 21st century. And they put in place a set of principles for Agenda 21. And as I said, they're having another meeting this year. It's called Rio Plus 20. But here's one of the principles that they put in place for that meeting in Rio. Principle 15 says, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Now, this is what's called the precautionary principle, and it's a favorite one of the extreme environmentalists, and you hear it all the time. Well, and it was sort of implied in some of your questions about, well, aren't humans polluting? And aren't we doing these changes? And maybe we should act anyway. Well, what they're saying in Principle 15 is they're saying, no, don't worry about the science. You don't need the evidence. Just if you think there's a threat, then act on it. Well, who's going to decide when it's a threat and at what level? These people are, or they'll come along and say, oh, well, water's a serious problem. We're going to come in and take total control of the water, and we're doing it to save the planet, and we know what's good for you. And that's the mentality behind that precautionary principle. And there it is, built right into Agenda 21 in the 1992 Declaration. And, of course, behind it was our dear friend Morris Strong.
Tell us about him a bit.
Well, Morris Strong, as I said, was he came from a family that, by Canadian standards, would be considered socialist. His sister has been a Marxist, openly declared throughout her life, and he left the family farm at the age of 15, and as they went to the States, became a very successful industrialist. But he's very, very good, as I said, at not only in organization of bureaucracies and systems, but also very, very good at getting people involved with his plans. Now, one of the ways that he did it was early in his career when he ran the Power Corporation, which is one of the big sort of corporations, overarching corporations that's into all sorts of things. He hired Paul Martin Jr., who later became the Prime Minister of Canada, and of course through that and through all the other contacts, he got to know pretty well a lot of powerful people, and you see that in the list of people in the Club of Rome, and of course that's why. He was so easily able to do what he wanted to do, and that is go to the UN and get a position at the UN. Now, I understand right now he's in China. He's been there for a few years, and the story is that the U.S. government want to arrest him for his involvement with his son and Kofi Annan and his son in the oil for food in Iraq crisis. And there was a story recently that he wanted to come back to Canada for his 85th birthday, but they basically said, if you show up, we'll arrest you. But his organization, and the reason that they used the UN, of course, was that he set up the climate change program. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up through the United Nations Environment Program, and it was very, very carefully designed with a premeditated objective. Now, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He organized it through the World Meteorological Organization. And the reason that was done was because that meant then that every weather agency in every country in the world is involved. And they're the people that nominate who will serve on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and of course they control it. That way, he has control of the weather bureaucracies in every country in the world. So NOAA, for example, have been very much involved. The Environment Canada. In fact, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment Canada chaired the first meeting of the IPCC in Villach, Austria in 1985. So all of this was orchestrated to achieve the goal of controlling the message that was going to go out about weather and climate through the bureaucracies. Now, of course, if you're a politician and a scientist at NOAA says, "Well, Mr. Politician, here's what's going on," who are you to challenge it? And of course, this is how the bureaucracies have been able to control the whole process. Now, let me explain a little bit more about this. John, I used to think that the idea about commissions of inquiry were superb ideas. You know, there's a fight going on, people are disagreeing, and the government come in and say, "Oh, we'll have a commission of inquiry." And I used to think, "Well, wonderful, finally get the politics out of the issue." The very first commission of inquiry I got appointed to was actually over water. It was at a lake in Manitoba. They were fighting over it. And the government said, "Oh, we'll have a commission of inquiry." I'm put on the commission. Well, that's when I learned how it happens, because we got the definition of the problem and the terms of reference under which we looked at the problem. In other words, the government, through the bureaucracies, limited and directed our research. And I went to the chairman, Mr. Duncan, at the time, and said, "Mr. Duncan, if you don't go to the government and tell the government to give us access to all of the information, I'm going to go to the media and say, our hands are being tied. We couldn't even get the data to begin to define the problem. And yet they wanted a solution." Well, that wasn't what they wanted. What they wanted was to shut it up and push it aside and not have to deal with it from a political perspective. Now, to give you an idea of that, I remember a few years ago, before he died, Chief Justice Warren, who was appointed to the Warren Commission to look at the Kennedy assassination, and the interviewer said, "Well, Mr. Warren, why didn't you look at the mafia connection in Dallas and Jack Ruby?" And Warren just said, "It wasn't in my terms of reference." Now, that's
wasn't in my terms of reference.
Yeah. You see, that's a comment. As soon as I heard it, I knew exactly what he was saying. But for most of the audience, it wouldn't mean a thing. And you talk about conspiracies. Where are the biggest conspiracy theories than over the assassination of John F. Kennedy? And it's because a full disclosure, a full investigation, everything on the table just never happened. And so, of course, what Morris Strong did, you say, what's that got to do with the climate issue? Well, when Morris Strong, he wrote the definition for climate change. And everybody thinks, oh, no, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN, are looking at all of climate change. No, they're not. They're looking at only human causes of climate change. And
that is extraordinary. I mean,
well,
that should be a banner headline somewhere.
Well, it's in articles I've written, and I've spoken about it lots. And now they claim in the most recent report that they changed that, but they couldn't change that because the reports are building one on the other. And when you look at the agents of forcing, now that is, forcing is something where if you change it, it causes a change in the climate or weather, and the ones they look at are very, very limited, and so they narrowed the search to focus on humans and focus on human CO2, and they did it by their definition of climate change. And of course, as I keep telling people, you can't possibly determine what effect humans are having if you don't know how much the climate changes naturally. And so, like I mentioned about CO2, well, they say, well, we know how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. No, they don't. And the other greenhouse gas, water vapor, which is 95% of the greenhouse gases by volume, we can only estimate within 20% how much water vapor is in the atmosphere at any given time. So when you start to even break down even the simplest things, you can expose what they've done and how they've been able to fool people. And of course, the few of us that tried to practice science as it should be practiced, that is, all scientists should be skeptics, what did they do? They called us global warming skeptics. Well, yes, that's what a scientist does. But for the public, the term skeptic has a completely different connotation. Oh, it's somebody who doesn't believe in anything. You know, they're just skeptical about everything. You know, well, sorry, no, that's a contrarian. That's a different issue. But this is how they've played with the games and played with the words and been able to fool everybody, or virtually everybody.
Well, we're still using catalytic converters on our cars.
Yep.
What's become of sulfur dioxide, the old SO2? I mean, what sort of content do we have that? You said it's about 4% for carbon dioxide?
It's slightly less than 4% for carbon dioxide. The other one is nitrous oxide, methane. The four major greenhouse gases naturally are water vapor, 95% by volume, CO2, less than 4%, methane is about 0.013, I don't remember the numbers right off the top of my head, nitrous oxide is even less. And of course, you see, one of the things that they do is they create these magical indexes. For example, I remember when methane became the focus, and it became part of the agenda to get rid of cattle. Oh, the cattle are producing methane, it's destroying, it's part of global warming. What they haven't told you is that methane has been going down for the last 17 years without any government legislation at all. And so you mentioned about the sulfates. That became an issue because every time a problem arises, they come up with some sort of fix. And I can't say it's an explanation, it's just a fix. Remember I mentioned earlier in the program, John, we were talking about how from 1940 to 1970, when I got into climate, the consensus was cooling.
Yes.
Well, they've tried to argue, well, it wasn't a consensus. Well, I know it was. In fact, the CIA spent millions of dollars on research on the impact of cooling on world food production and social unrest and how they'd have to deal with that as an agency. And I knew Bill Dando at the University of North Dakota, who got a $2 million grant to study. He was an expert in world wheat production, and he got $2 million to study how reduction of world wheat would have an impact. So I know that it was the consensus. But the idea of, as I say, the cooling, this was a problem for them. Because we're looking at the graph, and people like Anthony Watts and Richard Lindzen and Fred Singer and a few of us that were daring to raise questions said, well, hang on a minute. You're saying that the increase of CO2 is causing an increase in temperature, and it's human CO2 that's causing it. Well, the increase in the production of CO2 by humans was most dramatic after the Second World War.
Unbelievable. Tell you what, Dr. Tim Ball, let's just pause for a minute here. We'll take our news break and so forth, and we'll come right back, carry on with Dr. Tim Ball, and we'll find out what's up with the UN and what happened to that bunch in East Anglia and other things that put weeds in very unpleasant places on the anatomies of the Guardians. This is Coast to Coast AM. And I would say that some of you who are sending in emails in support and some who are slightly argumentative also qualify as wild things, as does our guest tonight, Dr. Tim Ball. It's very, very interesting. This is a very sensitive subject because I have to tell you something. Nobody likes it when it goes left-leaning, and nobody likes it when it goes right-leaning because, as I have said many times, and I will continue to say even a month, it's no big deal, but this is supposed to be a big one. Some have said somewhere up around Alaska. Some have said down around New Zealand. So in the end, they're tracking it with the best data that they have. But all intelligence is well, it's never unambiguous. It's always subject to a little wiggle room. Eric Holder is in a little bit of hot water, as much as he will allow himself to be in. Major news networks, as well as Representative Blake Farenthold, and they're taking to the airwaves to discuss how is it that this information about Fast and Furious lay upon his desk for 10 months. So he either did nothing about it or did not do his job. I'll tell you a quick story. I can't remember where I heard it. But Stalin was about to pass on into the next world, and he summoned Khrushchev to him. And he handed Khrushchev 2 envelopes, marked 1 and 2. He told Khrushchev, if you get in trouble, open the first envelope. If you get in trouble again, you open the second envelope. Well, the first problem came up, which involved the Berlin situation, and he had to open the first envelope. And on the paper was written, blame it all on me. And so he did. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis came up sometime later, and he opened envelope number 2. And inside, there was one sentence, which read, make out 2 envelopes. It may be time for Mr. Holder to make out 2 envelopes, because I don't think anybody gave him 2 envelopes. Otherwise, I think he would have taken a hike by now, but then again, that's just me. I said it many times, and you've said it too, that the Internet is probably the greatest tool for learning and knowledge and information gathering on this planet. Absolutely unsurpassed for gathering information. However, there are 10 reasons posted on InfoWars, which is always a good little site to go to, which will make you understand that nothing you do on the Internet will...
Going through kind of a replay with the wars that we're going through now, and I want the American public to be aware of the fact that Vietnam is actually the norm when it comes to the American way of war and the American style of conflict. World War II, which was a big mobilization war with a lot of involvement with logistics, was very much the exception to the rule. And World War I was also an exception in terms of an expeditionary force on the European continent. But the main majority of America's struggles have been Vietnam-style conflicts, going back to the American Revolution, which was America's longest declared war, 8 years long. And at that time, we were the Viet Cong. And we were fighting the British Empire with what many would consider a dirty, unorthodox, unconventional form of guerrilla insurgency. And we won ourselves our independence. And going up through to the Vietnam War, there was the Plains Indian Wars, and they were very much the precursor to Vietnam because there was no strategic points to be taken. Basically, all the American Frontier Army could rely on was body counts, which people would read about in papers back in the big cities, and they fought their way to the Pacific, and it was very similar to Vietnam in the sense that many of the Indian resistance fighters would cross the Mexican border, or they'd cross the Canadian border, and thereby the Frontier Army couldn't follow them because that would be a violation of boundaries and treaties with other sovereign nation states that the United States government recognized federally. And so as a result, you had this precursor all the way up through the Philippine insurgency to Vietnam itself. So this has very much been the norm of America's type of warfare. But Vietnam was by far the longest war we've ever fought, longer by a decade than what seems to be our now infinite war in Iraq. And because it started in 1945 on September 26th, when during unrest in Saigon, the first American death occurred. It was an OSS officer, meaning Office of Strategic Services, and his name was Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey, and he was killed by Viet Minh guerrillas. And this was right after he had just filed his report stating in his opinion that the U.S. ought to clear out of Southeast Asia. And you're absolutely right. That's what this holiday has to deal with, is our ultimate withdrawal from Vietnam, which was March 29th of 1973. And,
Douglas, it's a hell of a thing because we're divided into, it seems like, about three segments.
Yeah.
You have the people that stay home watching their loved ones and their friends go off to these wars. You got the ones that actually do go off to the wars, that are actually in the stuff.
Yes.
You know, getting hurt, getting killed.
Yes.
And then you got these Prague politicians that are up there orchestrating it all. And so that's why I wanted to talk to you very much, particularly about the commemorization of the end of it. But good Lord, man, this is really kind of a tougher line to try and stay balanced on than I thought it would be, because of all the emotion involved between the politicians who don't care, like Lefty said in Donnie Brasco. A guy you don't know sends you out to go kill another guy that you don't know.
Yeah,
and we're supposed to find nobility in that somewhere.
Yeah, if there's a nobility to be found, it's to be found in this. And this is one reason why this holiday needs to be commemorated, to keep it in the minds of everybody, because this was, whether we consider it casual or symptomatic of American decline, this truly was the defining moment in American history in a way that World War II was not. What people don't understand was that we still had the draft, which was ongoing from World War II, and people responded to that draft. And these were working men that responded to it. And there were, of course, about maybe 20 or 30 American women who died in service in Vietnam. But the overwhelming amount of, in those days, was that this was a man's war, and men were answering the call. And these were middle-class men. And this is without resorting to some Marxian tactic of creating a sense of class conflict or warfare, very much what you...
Ever be private again. The federal government can now retain your Internet activity for 5 years, even if you have no links to terrorism. Potential employers are demanding to see your Internet activity. Law enforcement is watching you. Government agencies are watching you. The White House is watching you. Truth teams, they'll be scouring the Internet for any rumors that are not true as the presidential election comes closer. They're monitoring and recording all talk radio. Hi, for anybody uninvited who's joining our program in progress. Hi, we're watching you too, just so you know. Foreign governments are watching you. We are all being encouraged to spy on one another on the Internet. Your ISP is watching you. Your Internet service provider is watching you. And the NSA is watching everyone and everything. Don't you feel better about technology just every minute? All right, then. Check the Coast to Coast website. You should always check the Coast website, coasttocoastam.com. There's a lot of interesting stuff on there. Some fantastic artwork by Bill Hoflich. Naps News is there. And, of course, you have an opportunity to become a Coast Insider. And for all of you who have done so, as the radio landscape shifts, you have shifted with it. And we thank you very much for that. That will ensure that there is an uninterrupted flow of non-mainstream media material. Think of Coast to Coast as an oasis of rational thought, hidden in the desert of vacuous content and opinion. All right, we'll be bringing on Douglas Dietrich in just a moment, so cinch down and mount up. The Caravan to Midnight leaves in 2 minutes on Coast to Coast AM. You know, many of us lost someone in the Vietnam conflict, so this is going to be a little bit sensitive for some. Come on onto the bridge, Douglas Dietrich, and let us set the stage for our talk tonight, because there's a lot of heartbreak still over Vietnam and the people that were lost there.
Yes, and I really thank you for allowing me to address this issue with the American public, because it really needs to be addressed, because we're...
From an undisclosable location for reasons of security and therefore insecurity, cometh the hour, cometh the mothership, that is, Coast to Coast AM will just set her down gently, set her down gently. All right, there we are. Good evening, everybody. John B. Wells in with you for the night. I hope you've had a good week. And tonight, we have a program I think that you will like. We have brought back from just 2 weeks ago, Douglas Dietrich. He'll be with us for the first hour. That's son of a sailor. He has some interesting perspectives on the Vietnam conflict. And not only that, he is a great proponent of an official National Day of commemoration for those who served that long, long war. He will give us some insights on many things, including what year the first American life was lost there, which will give you an idea exactly how long that conflict lasted. I got into a slight little twist last time when I was mentioning the Vietnam conflict. Between 73 and 75, we left largely in 73, but it was officially over in 75. That's when Saigon fell, and so anyway, Douglas will clear us up on that. Then, the remainder of the show, Dr. Tim Ball. He is a renowned environmental consultant and former professor of climatology at the University of Winnipeg. And his extensive science background in climatology, especially environmental issues and sustainable development, the reconstruction of past climates, and the impact of climate change on human history and the human condition, make him the ideal head of the National Resources Stewardship Project. He works on other things: water resources, pollution prevention, environmental regulations, the impact of government policy on business and economics. Will be invaluable as NRSP tackles other issues as time goes by. Well, the earthquake that was predicted to occur earlier in the week did not happen, but that does not mean that it will not happen. Several students, full-time students of earthquake behavior, are still, if they miss it by a day or two or a week or